7 years after he left me to starve with a 72-hour eviction notice, my ex just walked into my office with a warning. I'm not the woman I think I am, and we're both being hunted for a secret hidden in my own DNA. The sound of a boiling kettle is supposed to be comforting, but back then it was the sound of a countdown. It meant I had exactly 3 minutes until my cup of instant noodles was soft enough to eat, my only meal for the day. At 24, I was a master of the poverty shimmy, a delicate dance of moving money between accounts that didn't have any, just to keep the lights on for one more night. I lived in a studio apartment in a part of the city where the sirens never stopped screaming and the radiator hissed like a dying animal, but never actually produced heat. I wasn't alone in that freezing room, though. I had Elias. Elias was the kind of man who looked like he belonged on a sailboat in the Mediterranean, not huddling under a threadbare duvet in a drafty apartment. He had this effortless grace, a way of leaning against a peeling wall and making it look like a choice rather than a necessity. We were us against the world, or so I thought. We'd met in college, two idealistic kids who thought love could pay the rent. But by the time the economy crashed and my father's medical bills started piling up like a mountain of debt I'd never summit, the idealism had curdled into a cold, hard desperation. I remember the night everything changed. It was February, the kind of wet, bone-chilling cold that settles into your marrow. I had just come home from a double shift at the diner, my feet throbbing and my apron smelling of old grease. I found Elias sitting at the small wooden table we'd found on a curb. There were no lights on, just the pale blue glow of his phone screen reflecting in his eyes. "The eviction notice came," I said, my voice cracking. I dropped my bag on the floor. "We have 72 hours, Elias. I talked to my manager. He's going to give me an advance, but it's not enough. Maybe if you could ask your brother." He didn't look up. He didn't even blink. He just stared at that screen, his thumb hovering over the glass. "I can't do this anymore, Sarah," he whispered. "I know it's hard," I said, moving toward him, reaching out to touch his shoulder. "But we're a team. We'll find a way. We always do." He flinched away from my touch. That was the first crack. He stood up, and for the first time in 3 years, he looked at me like I was a stranger. Worse, he looked at me like I was an anchor dragging him into the dark, murky depths of a sea he didn't want to drown in. He didn't say another word that night. He just went to the corner where he kept his duffel bag. I fell asleep on the sofa, exhausted by the sheer weight of existence, convinced that morning would bring a plan. I woke up to a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure on my chest. The apartment was freezing. The space by the door where his boots usually sat was empty. The duffel bag was gone, his toothbrush, his books, the sweater I'd knitted for him, everything. He hadn't even left a note. He hadn't left $5 for the bus. He had simply vanished into the gray morning, leaving me with a 3-day countdown to homelessness and a heart that felt like it had been hollowed out with an ice cream scoop. I didn't die, of course. People rarely do from a broken heart, though I certainly tried my best to wither away. I worked until my vision blurred and my bones ached. I slept on a friend's floor for 6 months, then moved into a room with 4 other girls. I climbed. I didn't just climb. I clawed. I went from waitress to assistant, from assistant to manager, and eventually, through a mix of ruthless pragmatism and sheer spite, I built a boutique consulting firm that specialized in fixing the unfixable. I learned that the only person you can truly rely on is the one staring back at you in the mirror. I traded my empathy for a sharp suit and a high-rise office with a view of the city that once tried to swallow me whole. I liked the view from the top. The sirens sounded much quieter from the 42nd floor. 7 years passed, 7 years of silence. Elias became a ghost story I told myself late at night, a reminder of why I never let anyone get close enough to see the cracks in my armor. I heard rumors occasionally. Someone saw him in London. Someone heard he'd married into money. I didn't care, or I told myself I didn't. Then came the Tuesday that broke the streak. I was finishing a meeting with a high-profile client when my assistant, Maya, buzzed through the intercom. Her voice sounded hesitant, which wasn't like her. Maya was a shark. "Sarah? There's a man in the lobby. He doesn't have an appointment and security tried to turn him away, but he won't leave." "Tell him to call the front desk for a slot in 6 months," I snapped, gathering my papers. "He says it's about the 72 hours." Maya whispered. The air left the room. My lungs suddenly felt like they were filled with lead. 72 hours, the exact window we had before the eviction, the last words I'd spoken to him before he left me to the wolves. "Send him up," I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the sprawling metropolis. My reflection was sharp. Expensive haircut, tailored blazer, the image of a woman who had everything under control. When the door clicked open, I didn't turn around immediately. I waited, letting the silence stretch, letting him feel the weight of the space I now occupied. "You've done well for yourself, Sarah," a voice said. It was him. The voice was deeper, rougher, like it had been dragged over gravel, but it was unmistakably Elias. I turned slowly. He looked terrible. This wasn't the man who married into money. This was a man who looked like he'd been running for the better part of a decade. His clothes were high quality but stained and rumpled. His hair was thinning at the temples, and his eyes, they were frantic. They darted around my office, settling on the luxury leather chairs and the modern art on the walls, with a mixture of awe and something that looked like terror. "What do you want, Elias?" I asked. I didn't offer him a seat. I didn't offer him water. I offered him nothing but the cold reality of his presence. He took a step forward, his hands trembling. He wasn't looking at me with love or even regret. He was looking at me with the desperation of a drowning man who had finally spotted a lifeboat. "I didn't come here to apologize," he said, his voice cracking just like mine had 7 years ago. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't even want it. I came because you're the only person I know who can handle a mess this big." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick, yellowed envelope. He walked to my mahogany desk and dropped it. It landed with a heavy thud. "They're coming for me, Sarah," he whispered, glancing at the door as if expecting it to be kicked in at any second. "And if they find me, they're going to find out what I took from them to keep you safe 7 years ago. I need you to hide this. And then I need you to help me disappear again." I looked at the envelope, then back at him. "To keep me safe? You left me with nothing. You left me to lose everything. You think I just walked away because I was scared?" Elias laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "I walked away because I owed people money you couldn't even dream of. I took the debt with me so they wouldn't come for you. But the debt didn't go away, Sarah. It grew. And now, it's not just about money anymore." Before I could respond, the heavy glass doors of my office suite rattled. Outside in the lobby, I heard the muffled sound of a struggle and Maya's sharp, panicked scream. Elias's face went pale, a ghostly white that made his eyes pop. "They're here," he hissed, lunging across the desk to grab my wrist. "Sarah, listen to me. If you don't take that envelope and get out of the private elevator right now, neither of us makes it out of this building alive." The sound of shattering glass echoed through the corridor, a violent intrusion into the sterile silence of my executive suite. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that belonged to the girl I used to be, not the woman I had become. "The private elevator, Sarah, move!" Elias's voice was a whip, cracking through my momentary paralysis. I didn't think. I acted on pure, cold instinct. I swept the yellowed envelope off the desk and shoved it into the hidden compartment of my leather briefcase. My fingers fumbled with the biometric scanner under the mahogany lip of my desk, a feature I'd installed more out of paranoia than actual perceived need. With a soft hiss, a panel in the wood-paneled wall slid back, revealing the small, dimly lit service lift. I stepped inside, my heels clicking sharply on the metal floor. Elias scrambled in behind me, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. As the doors began to slide shut, I caught a glimpse of the office entrance. 2 men in charcoal gray suits, the kind of suits that cost $5,000 and were designed to blend into a boardroom, stepped over the shards of my glass door. They didn't look like thugs. They looked like auditors, but the silenced pistols in their hands told a very different story. One of them made eye contact with me just as the doors sealed. His expression wasn't angry. It was bored. That terrified me more than a snarl ever could. The elevator dropped with a gut-wrenching lurch. We weren't going to the lobby. I had programmed this lift to bypass the main floors and exit directly into the sub-basement parking garage where my armored sedan was parked. "Who are they, Elias?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. I turned to him in the cramped space. He was slumped against the railing, his face ashen. There was a dark stain blooming across the shoulder of his jacket. I hadn't noticed it before, but the metallic scent of blood was now unmistakable in the small enclosure. "The Vane Group," he wheezed, clutching his side. "You've heard of them, haven't you? You probably even consulted for one of their subsidiaries." My stomach turned. The Vane Group was a multinational shadow, a conglomerate so vast and so deeply embedded in global infrastructure that they were practically a sovereign nation. They didn't collect debts. They erased liabilities. "You stole from Vane?" I whispered, horror dawning on me. "Elias, nobody steals from them and lives. Why would you bring this to me? Why would you put a target on my back after 7 years? He looked up at me, his eyes glassy. "Because you're the only one who knows how to move the data, Sarah. Look at the envelope. It's not just money, it's the ledger, the real one." The elevator doors hissed open into the cold, damp air of the sub-basement. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the rows of luxury cars. I grabbed Elias's arm, hauling him toward my silver sedan. My hand shook as I pressed the key fob. The lights flashed, a beacon in the gloom. I shoved him into the passenger seat and scrambled behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, a comforting growl of German engineering. I didn't wait to see if the auditors were behind us. I slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching against the concrete, and tore toward the exit ramp. "Where are we going?" Elias asked, his voice getting weaker. "To a place that doesn't exist," I said, my jaw set. I'd spent 7 years building a fortress of a life, and if I had to burn it all down to survive the next hour, I would. I drove with a focused intensity, weaving through the midday traffic of the city. I checked my mirrors every 5 seconds, looking for the charcoal suits or any car that lingered too long in my wake. We headed toward the industrial district, toward a warehouse I'd purchased through a shell company 3 years ago. It was my in-case-of-emergency plan, a place stocked with clean plates, cash, and medical supplies. As we sped down the rain-slicked highway, I reached over and grabbed the envelope from my briefcase. With one hand on the wheel, I tore it open. Inside wasn't a ledger. There were no columns of numbers, no bank account passwords. Instead, a stack of photographs spilled out onto my lap. My blood turned to ice. The first photo was of me, 3 years ago, walking out of a coffee shop in Paris. The second was of me in my bed, sleeping, taken from a vantage point that shouldn't have been possible, outside my 24th-story window. The third was of me at my father's funeral, a day I thought I had spent in total isolation. Every photo was dated. Every photo was a record of my life for the last 7 years. "You said you left to protect me," I said, my voice barely a whisper, the car swerving slightly as I stared at the images of my own life being cataloged like a specimen. "You said you took the debt and ran, but you weren't running, were you? You were watching." Elias didn't answer. I looked over at him, ready to scream, ready to kick him out of the moving car. He was unconscious, his head lolling against the window, the blood from his shoulder now soaking into the fine leather of my passenger seat. But that wasn't what stopped my heart. It was his phone. It had fallen from his lap onto the floor mat, the screen still glowing. A message was displayed on the screen, sent only seconds ago. "Package delivered. She has the envelope. Engaging phase 2 now. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He hadn't come to me for help. He had been the delivery boy. He had spent 7 years as their puppet, and I had just driven the ledger exactly where they wanted it to go. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of a deserted warehouse street. I needed to get out. I needed to run. I reached for the door handle, but the locks clicked shut with a sharp electronic snap. The dashboard display, usually reserved for navigation and music, flickered and died. A second later, it rebooted, but my GPS was gone. In its place was a live video feed. It was a view of my own car taken from a drone hovering directly above us. A voice drifted through the car's speakers, smooth and distorted by a modulator. "Drive, Sarah. If you stop the car, we detonate the charge under the fuel tank. You have 10 minutes to reach the coordinates appearing on your screen, or we finish what Elias started 7 years ago." I looked at the dashboard. A set of coordinates pulsed in red. They didn't lead to my warehouse. They led to the one place I vowed I would never return to, the old crumbling apartment building where my life had first fallen apart. And then, the passenger door, the one I had just seen Elias unconscious against, began to open from the outside. Elias didn't move, but a hand reached in from the shadows of the street, a hand wearing a heavy gold signet ring I recognized instantly. It was the ring my father had been wearing when he was buried. "Hello, Sarah," a voice whispered from the darkness outside the car. "I believe you have something of mine." The hand with the gold signet ring gripped the edge of the door frame, the knuckles white and scarred. I stared at it, my breath hitching in my throat. That ring, a heavy Victorian piece with a weeping willow etched into the face, had been on my father's finger when the lid of his casket was closed. I had touched it one last time before they lowered him into the earth. The man attached to the hand leaned into the light of the car's interior. He wasn't my father. He was younger, perhaps in his late 50s, with skin like cured leather and eyes that held the flat, dead sheen of a shark's. He wore a high-collared coat that seemed to swallow the light around him. "Arthur!" Elias groaned from the passenger seat, his eyes fluttering open. He didn't look surprised. He looked defeated. "You're late, Elias," the man, Arthur, said. His voice was a cultured rasp. He didn't look at Elias, his eyes were locked on mine. "And you've made a mess of the upholstery. Sarah, it's a pleasure to finally meet the woman who has caused the Vane Group so much administrative overhead." "Get away from my car," I hissed, my hand hovering over the gear shift. "If there's a bomb, you're standing right next to it." Arthur smiled, a thin, bloodless line. "The bomb is a contingency for you, Sarah. I, on the other hand, am the solution. Give me the envelope and perhaps we can discuss why your father's grave was empty when we went to collect what he owed us." The world tilted. My father's grave was empty? I wanted to scream, to tell him he was lying, but the cold, clinical way he said it made the air leave my lungs. My father hadn't been a rich man. He'd been a librarian who died of a long, expensive illness. Or so I thought. "Drive," Elias whispered, grabbing my forearm. His grip was surprisingly strong for a man who looked like he was bleeding out. "Sarah, drive now." I didn't wait for a second invitation. I slammed the car into drive and floored the accelerator. Arthur didn't move to stop us. He simply stepped back into the shadows as the car roared forward, the door swinging shut with the momentum of the turn. As I sped toward the coordinates on the dashboard, the drone followed, a silent black speck against the gray sky. My mind was a hurricane. The photos, the ring, the empty grave, the Vane Group. It was all swirling into a pattern I couldn't yet see. "Talk," I commanded Elias. "Talk, or I swear I'll drive us both into the river." Elias leaned his head back, his face glistening with sweat. "Your father wasn't who you thought he was, Sarah. He didn't just work at a library. He was the chief archivist for the Vane Group. He was the one who kept the off-ledger accounts. When he got sick, he realized they were going to dispose of him once his mind started to go. So he stole the one thing that kept them from being dismantled by the authorities. "The ledger," I said, the word feeling heavy in my mouth. "It wasn't a book, Sarah. It was a sequence, a biometric key hidden in something he knew you would keep. Something he knew the Vane Group couldn't find unless they tracked your every move for years." I looked down at the briefcase on the floorboard, the envelope. I reached in and pulled out the photos again. I flipped them over, searching for a code, a hidden message. Nothing. Just the dates. Wait, the dates. I looked at the photo of me in Paris, May 14th, the photo of me sleeping, November 2nd, the funeral, August 19th. "The dates aren't when the photos were taken," I whispered. "They're coordinates, or timestamps. They're the combination to the safe." Elias coughed, a spray of red hitting the dashboard. "The one in the apartment, the one behind the radiator." The old apartment, the place where I had spent 3 days crying on a bare floor after Elias vanished. I had lived there for 2 years. I had scrubbed every inch of those walls, desperate to get my security deposit back. I had never found a safe. "There is no safe there, Elias. I checked every inch of that hellhole." "It's not in the walls, Sarah," he said, his voice dropping to a thready whisper. "It's in the radiator." "The hiss? The one you thought was a leak? That was the cooling system for the drive. Your father didn't leave you a debt. He left you a weapon." The coordinates on the screen flashed. We were 3 blocks away. The neighborhood hadn't changed. It was still a graveyard of broken dreams and boarded-up windows. I pulled the car to a stop in front of the familiar, crumbling brick facade. The drone hovered overhead, its red light blinking like a mocking eye. "You have 2 minutes," the voice through the speakers reminded me. "Bring the drive out, or the building and the car become one." I looked at Elias. He was pale, his breathing shallow. "Stay here," I said. "If I'm not back in 90 seconds, try to crawl out of the car." I grabbed my briefcase and ran. The lobby of the building smelled of stale cigarettes and despair. I didn't wait for the elevator. It hadn't worked since 2012. I sprinted up the stairs, my lungs burning, the memories of my former life hitting me with every step. Apartment 4B. I kicked the door open. It wasn't locked. In fact, it looked exactly as it had the day I left. The same peeling wallpaper, the same stains on the floor. And there, in the corner, was the radiator. I knelt beside it, my hands trembling. I looked at the photos, the dates. May 14th, November 2nd, August 19th. I looked at the valves on the side of the iron heater. There were 3 of them, rusted and ancient. I turned the first one to the 5th notch, then the 14th, the second to the 11th, then the 2nd. As I touched the 3rd valve, a soft mechanical hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. A panel on the top of the radiator slid back, revealing a sleek, modern interface. A fingerprint scanner. I placed my thumb on it. Access denied. I tried my index finger. Access denied. "It has to be the Willow," a voice said from the doorway. I spun around. Arthur was standing there, his coat damp from the rain. He held a small, velvet-lined box. Inside, resting on a bed of white silk, was a severed human thumb, preserved in a clear liquid. The nail was clipped short, just like my father's always were. "Your father was a very clever man, Sarah," Arthur said, stepping into the room. "But he forgot that even the best locks can be opened if you have the right key. He didn't want you to have the money. He wanted you to be the lure. He knew we'd never stop looking for him, so he staged his death and left you as the breadcrumb trail." "He's alive?" I gasped, the world spinning. "My father is alive?" "He was," Arthur said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the radiator. "Until we caught up with him in Rio last week. He gave us the ring. He gave us the location, but he wouldn't give us the thumb. He made us earn it." Arthur reached into the box, his gloved fingers plucking the gruesome key from the vial. He stepped toward the radiator, ignoring me as if I were nothing more than a piece of furniture. But as he reached for the scanner, the hum of the radiator changed. It went from a low thrum to a high-pitched whine. "Wait," I said, backing away. "If he gave you the location, why did you need Elias to bring me here? Why the photos? Why the 72-hour threat?" Arthur paused, the thumb inches from the glass. A look of genuine confusion crossed his face. "What threat?" "We didn't send Elias. Elias was a rogue agent who stole the coordinates from our database months ago. We've been chasing him." I looked toward the window where the drone was still hovering. The red light wasn't blinking anymore. It was solid. And then I heard the sound of my car's engine roaring to life down on the street. I lunged for the window. Below, I saw my silver sedan peeling away from the curb, tires smoking. Elias was behind the wheel, looking perfectly healthy, a headset pressed to his ear. He looked up at the window, and for a split second our eyes met. He didn't look sorry. He looked triumphant. He tapped his watch, and as the car sped around the corner, a countdown began to blare from the radiator interface. T-10, 9, 8. "Arthur!" I screamed. But Arthur wasn't looking at the countdown. He was looking at the screen of the radiator, which had just displayed a new message. "Welcome home, Elias!" Purge sequence initiated. 3, 2. Arthur didn't wait for the final second. He lunged at me, his heavy coat flapping like the wings of a predatory bird, and tackled me towards the open doorway. We hit the hallway's rotting carpet just as a muffled thump vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the bone-shattering explosion I had braced for. There was no fire, no flying shrapnel. Instead, a high-frequency whine, so sharp it felt like a needle being driven into my eardrums, erupted from the apartment. A cloud of thick, iridescent white vapor began to pour out of the radiator, smelling of ozone and scorched copper. "Digital thermite," Arthur hissed, pushing himself up. He looked back into the room. The radiator wasn't just melting, it was dissolving into a puddle of slag, taking the interface and whatever drive was hidden inside with it. The purge isn't just a data wipe, it's a physical erasure of the hardware. Elias didn't come for the ledger, he came to make sure nobody could have it. I scrambled to my feet, my head spinning. Through the window at the end of the hall, I could still see the red light of the drone. It was moving, following the path of my car. "My car," I gasped, the realization hitting me. "He has my briefcase, the envelope, the photos." "The photos were a distraction, you fool," Arthur snapped, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the back fire escape. "He used your emotional connection to the past to lure you here, while he bypassed your car's security. The ledger isn't in the radiator. It never was. The radiator was the transmitter." I stumbled after him, my heels catching on the iron slats of the fire escape. The cold rain was turning into a downpour, slicking the metal. "If it was a transmitter, where did it send the data?" "To the only mobile receiver within a 5-block radius that had your biometric clearance," Arthur said, his voice grim as we hit the alley floor. "Your car, Sarah. He didn't just steal your vehicle. He stole the most powerful encryption key in the Vane Group's history, and he did it using your own thumbprint on the elevator scanner and your own proximity to the radiator to trigger the transfer." My stomach dropped. I had built that car with the best security money could buy, including a localized server for my firm's most sensitive documents. Elias hadn't been running from the Vane Group. He'd been playing us against each other to get close enough to the well to fill his bucket. Arthur pulled a small, sleek transmitter from his pocket. He tapped the screen, and a map of the city appeared. A single blue dot was moving rapidly toward the harbor. "He's heading for the docks," Arthur said. He whistled sharply, and a black SUV with tinted windows drifted out of the shadows at the end of the alley. "Get in." "Why would I go anywhere with you?" I demanded, backing away. "You just told me you were going to grave rob my father." Arthur stopped, the rain dripping off the brim of his hat. He looked at me with something that might have been pity, if men like him were capable of it. Sarah, I told you your father was the chief archivist. I didn't tell you what he was archiving. He wasn't just keeping track of money, he was keeping track of people. Specifically, the biological assets the Vane Group has been cultivating for 30 years. Assets? What are you talking about? The reason Elias looks exactly like he did 7 years ago, Arthur said, his voice barely audible over the rain. The reason he knew exactly which phrases would trigger your cooperation. He isn't your ex-boyfriend, Sarah. He's a Series 4 Echo, and he's malfunctioning. I felt a coldness spread through me that had nothing to do with the weather. A what? Get in the car, Arthur commanded, or he reaches the extraction point, and the Vane Group loses the only proof that the Echo program exists. And if that happens, they'll have no reason to keep the original versions alive. The originals, I whispered, my hand reaching for the door handle of the SUV. My father and Elias? The real Elias died in that car accident 8 years ago, Sarah. The one you thought he walked away from with just a few scratches? He didn't walk away. The Vane Group replaced him to see if an Echo could sustain a long-term emotional bond with a high-value target like the daughter of their archivist. I felt like I was disappearing, like the world around me was a stage set being dismantled in the dark. My memories, my grief, the 3 days I spent crying on that apartment floor, it was all a lab report, a data point. I climbed into the SUV. Arthur followed, and the driver immediately floored it. We tore through the narrow streets, the sirens of the city fading behind us as we headed for the industrial wasteland of the waterfront. If Elias is a copy, I said, the words sticking in my throat, why is he running? Why steal the ledger? Because the ledger contains the kill codes for the Echoes, Arthur explained, checking a suppressed handgun. He doesn't want to be a biological asset anymore. He wants to be permanent, and to do that, he needs to wipe the primary servers. If he succeeds, he'll be the only version of himself left, and no one will ever be able to shut him down. We reached the docks in record time. The silver sedan was parked at the edge of Pier 17, its headlights cutting through the fog, shining out over the dark, churning water of the Atlantic. The driver's side door was hanging open. Arthur signaled to his men, and they fanned out, moving with lethal, silent grace. I stayed close to the SUV, my eyes scanning the shadows. The drone was hovering low over the water, its red eye fixed on a small motorboat tied to the end of the pier. "Elias!" I screamed, my voice lost in the wind. "Elias, stop!" A figure emerged from behind a stack of shipping containers. He was holding my briefcase in one hand and a flare gun in the other. He looked at us, and for the first time, I saw the cracks Arthur had mentioned. His skin looked too tight, his movements slightly jerky, like a film skipping frames. "It's not a ledger, Sarah," Elias shouted, his voice distorted, echoing with a strange metallic reverb. "It's a map to the facility where they're keeping him." "Who?" I cried out. "Your father." Elias stepped closer to the edge of the pier. "He's not in Rio. He's in a tank in a basement 3 miles from here. They didn't kill him, Sarah. They're using him to grow more of me, to grow more of you." I froze. "More of me?" Arthur raised his weapon. "Don't listen to him, Sarah. He's suffering from cognitive decay. He'll say anything to survive." "Am I?" Elias laughed, a sound that ended in a wet, choking cough. He looked at me, and for a second the flat artificial sheen in his eyes vanished, replaced by the boy I had loved in college. "Sarah, look at your wrist. The mole. The one you've had since you were 6. I looked down at my left wrist. I didn't even have to lift my sleeve. I knew exactly where it was. "It's gone, isn't it?" Elias whispered. "It disappeared after the accident. The one you don't quite remember. The one where you woke up in the hospital with concussion-related amnesia." My breath hitched. I pulled back my sleeve. My skin was perfect. Smooth, unmarked. I looked at the spot where the small brown mark should have been. It was gone. "The purge didn't just start in the apartment, Sarah." Elias said, his voice growing faint as he stepped onto the motorboat. "It started when you walked into that office this morning. You're not the one fixing the mess. You are the mess." He pointed the flare gun not at us, but at the silver sedan. "The car isn't a bomb, Sarah," he said, a tragic smile on his face. "It's a distraction. This is the real Ledger." He held up a small, glowing chip, the one he must have pulled from the briefcase. Then he tossed the flare into the gas tank of my car. The explosion was deafening. The shock wave knocked me back against the SUV. In the chaos of the fire and the smoke, I saw Elias's boat peel away into the dark harbor. But as I struggled to find my footing, a hand reached out from the back of the SUV, the one I had just stepped out of. A hand with a small brown mole on the wrist. "Don't worry, Sarah," a voice whispered from the darkness of the car's interior. My own voice, perfectly pitched, perfectly calm. "I'll take it from here." The door of the SUV swung wider, and for a moment the world ceased to exist. The woman sitting in the shadows was a mirror. She was me, but not me. Her skin had the slight pallor of someone who hadn't seen the sun in years. Her hair was longer, streaked with premature gray, and her eyes, those identical green eyes, were filled with a weary, jagged intelligence. She wore a medical bracelet on her left wrist, right above the small, dark mole that I had spent my life believing was a part of me. "Sarah?" I whispered, the name feeling like a sin. "Sarah B.," she corrected, her voice thin but steady. "I suppose it's time we met. Arthur, help me out." Arthur, the man who had just threatened to kill me, moved with surprising tenderness. He helped the original Sarah into a wheelchair that had been stowed in the back of the vehicle. She sat there, draped in a heavy wool blanket, looking out at the burning wreck of my car and the receding lights of Elias's boat. "You were an efficiency project," the original Sarah said, her voice cutting through the sound of the rain. 7 years ago, when the debt became too much, when the eviction notice came, I didn't just lose my mind, I lost my will to survive. The Vane Group approached my father with a deal. They would settle his debts and provide me with treatment if he handed over his archival secrets. But he went one step further. He suggested a replacement. I felt my knees buckle. I sank onto the wet concrete of the pier, my hands scraping against the gravel. "You created me to take your place, to do the work, to feel the pain?" "To be the version of me that wasn't broken," she said. And for the first time I saw a flash of resentment in her eyes. "I stayed in a facility being studied while you lived my life. You built my career. You grew the firm. You were the success I was too fragile to become." "And Elias?" I asked, looking toward the dark water. "Elias was the variable," Arthur chimed in, standing behind the original Sarah like a loyal hound. "The original Elias died in that crash. The echo we created to be your partner was meant to keep you stable, but he developed a flaw. He developed a soul. He started to care about you, the copy, more than the mission. He vanished 7 years ago because he found out the Vane Group was planning to retire you once the firm reached a certain valuation. He didn't leave you to starve, Sarah B. He left to find a way to save you. The urgent assistance he came for today wasn't about money or power. He needed me to trigger the radiator because my biometrics, the refined, perfected biometrics of a Series 4 Echo, were the only ones that could authorize the mass deletion of the Echo registry. He had used me to pull the trigger on his own death warrant, and mine. "The boat," I gasped, pointing toward the harbor. "Arthur, your men are going to kill him." "They have to," the original Sarah said coldly. "He has the ledger. If those names get out, the Vane Group falls. And if they fall, my treatment stops. I die." I looked at the woman in the wheelchair. She was the real one, the one with the mole and the memories. But she was a ghost, a hollowed-out shell of a person who was willing to murder the only man who had ever truly loved me, loved us. just to stay tethered to a life she had already abandoned. I looked at my own hands. I didn't have a mole. I didn't have a childhood. I was a collection of data points and refined cells. But I had the memories of the diner. I had the feeling of the cold apartment. I had the ache in my heart that felt more real than anything in that wheelchair. "You're wrong," I said, standing up. My voice was no longer trembling. It was the voice of the woman who had built a multi-million-dollar firm from nothing. "You think I'm the copy? You're the one who's been standing still for 7 years. I'm the one who lived." I didn't look at Arthur. I looked at the drone still hovering overhead. As a Series 4, I had been built with integrated tech interfaces. It was how I managed my firm's high-level security. I had always thought I was just good with computers, but now I realized I was part of the network. I closed my eyes and focused on the low-frequency hum of the drone. I felt the connection snap into place, a digital tether. I didn't need a keyboard. I needed a thought. Targeting override, authorization, Sarah B, command, scuttle. The drone's red eye flickered to blue. It suddenly veered away from Elias's boat and dived at a 45-degree angle directly into the black SUV's open fuel hatch. "Get back!" Arthur yelled, lunging for the wheelchair. The explosion was a blinding white flash. The SUV went up in a pillar of fire, the force of it knocking Arthur and the original Sarah backward toward the edge of the pier. The men in the charcoal suits, distracted by the chaos, stopped firing at the boat. I didn't wait. I ran toward the end of the pier. I didn't care about the Vane group. I didn't care about my original. "Elias!" I screamed. The boat slowed. In the distance, through the smoke and the rain, I saw him standing at the tiller. He looked at me, and even from 50 yards away, I could see the hesitation. He thought I was part of them. He thought the copy had finally chosen the creator. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the knitted sweater scrap I always carried, the one I'd kept from the apartment all those years ago. I held it high. He cut the engine. The boat drifted back toward the pier. As he pulled alongside the wooden pilings, Elias looked up at me. His skin was graying, his movement stiff. He was dying. The purge sequence he had initiated at the apartment was slowly shutting down his systems. "You did it," he whispered, reaching out a hand to help me down into the boat. "The registry, it's gone. They can't track the others. They can't track you. But they'll track us," I said, stepping onto the vibrating deck. I looked back at the pier. Arthur was dragging the original Sarah away from the burning wreck of the SUV. She was screaming, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. "Let them," Elias said, a faint smile touching his lips. "We have 72 hours before my core shuts down. I'd say that's enough time for one last plan." I looked at him, my flawed, beautiful, vanishing man. He had returned to me not for help, but to give me the only thing he had left, a choice. I turned the key in the ignition. We didn't head for the open sea. We headed for the heart of the city, back toward the high-rise office where my name, our name, was etched in glass, 42 stories high. The Vane Group thought they had created a tool. They thought they had built a perfect, compliant version of a broken woman. But they forgot one thing about the 72-hour notice. When you have nothing left to lose, you don't just survive. You burn everything down until the only thing left standing is the truth. As the boat disappeared into the fog, I felt a strange sensation on my left wrist. I looked down. The skin was beginning to itch, a small dark spot forming right where the mole should have been. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe it was the system rewriting itself. Or maybe, for the first time in my life, I was finally becoming real. We disappeared into the dark, two ghosts in a city of millions, ready to finish the war that had started in a cold apartment 7 years ago. Elias took my hand, and for the first time, the sound of the water against the hull wasn't a countdown. It was a beginning,